G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. Now this one's a little bit left of field, but it is a multi-part series on how to create 2D model sheets inside of Blender's Grease Pencil toolset. So if you love 2D animation, the Grease Pencil tool in Blender, and you want to make your own characters, then this is the series for you. This first video is all about how to block out your model sheet, where I basically work out the underlying anatomy of the character that I have designed. In future videos, we'll go through the process of adding clothing, finalizing the line work, adding color, and adding final touches such as shadows and highlights. And for those who are watching my videos and saying, "Hey Dicko, where's those fucking animation tutorials you promised your dog?" Well, settle down, they're on their way. This is actually quite related to that anyway, especially for those who are interested in 2D animation and want to be able to create characters that are consistent across their animation shots. You need to have model sheets. And for the uninformed, a model sheet is essentially a character drawn from different angles to allow animators to use as reference when they're animating their characters. It's also really useful when you're creating character rigs, especially for 2D animation rigs, where you need to have consistency between the images. And of course, for those who don't give a shit about 2D and want to focus on 3D modeling, characters design, all that sort of crap, then having a model sheet like this could really save you a lot of time in the future when it comes to modeling your character consistently, getting the details in there right, and having something on hand that you don't have to think about on the side, where you can copy and sculpt away, model away without any concern. Now, with enough of that said, let's just jump right into the Grease Pencil toolset in Blender and get started. So, this is going to be a time lapse of this whole thing. The actual process of drawing this for me took around 6 to 7 hours, simply because I was trying to line up the drawings. And that's really, really important because you're essentially just animating a character spinning around on a pivot. And you need to make sure that it's really consistent between the drawings so you can get a consistent outcome in the animation in the future, especially if you end up rigging these 2D model sheets. So to start off, I just use the default Blender Workspace for 2D animation. I haven't made any special changes or anything like that. The only change I did do, at least for my clarity, is change the brush color from black to red. That's about it. Now, the nice thing about using Blender to block out your model sheet is partly the timeline, but also the fact that you can edit your lines really easily. So you don't have to treat it specifically like a drawing tool. You can use it like a drafting tool and the 3D tool at the same time. So you can actually go into edit mode and actually manipulate the points of the lines you've drawn, similar to Illustrator, but you aren't constrained by Illustrator because Illustrator is not an animation tool. And unlike, say, a raster-based image editor like Photoshop or Procreate, when you're drawing the lines inside of Blender, they are scalable. So you aren't constrained by the resolution of the image you're making. It's basically infinite. The other thing is that we have an actual dedicated, not tacked on timeline for you to scrub between the poses easily. Whereas in Photoshop, you'd have to create the timeline, add your frames, and then do all other crap. Really frustrating, really time consuming. In Blender, you just draw on a new frame and it just creates the frame for you. Very simple. Now, for the blocking of the character, I would suggest going for a neutral pose, but trying to integrate a little bit of personality into that pose. And as an artist, it's up to you to imagine what the sort of neutral pose would be for a character given their personality traits. So you can go for something that's a bit more hunched, a bit more confident, or a bit more crazy. It really depends. But as long as the character is posed in a way that you can see all the major elements of that character without having to tweak it in the future, you're on the right track. So for instance, I would avoid, say, having an arm obscure part of the body at the front or at the back. Keep it relatively straight out. So when creating a model sheet like this, it's probably a good idea not to be too precious with your lines from the beginning. So for instance, you can see here with at least the 3/4 pose that I've drawn so far, it's very loose. It's not like I'm going straight into polish mode and adding line work, adding the final touches, all that sort of thing from the beginning. I'm keeping it really, really loose because ultimately what I'll have to do in the future as I start to work out the other front, side, and back poses is I'll have to tweak these lines to get them to line up and to rotate in a natural way. So not being precious with your lines is really important at this stage, as well as try not to think about the clothing at this stage. The clothing we're going to add in the future, but having a nice base for the clothes to sit on is probably more important at this time, and it allows you to just focus on the volume of that character rather than worrying about all the other nitty-gritty stuff at this time. The other thing I would recommend is that you should have a pretty good, solid idea of what the character is going to look like at this point already. And what I mean by that is that you should already know what the character looks like because you've done a few sketches in the past. So a few sketches of the body, of the face, of the clothing. You've got a fairly solid idea of who the character is as a personality, and you've already done some early preliminary designs in that regard. So once I've got that basic 3/4 view complete, I start to add on a new layer a set of guidelines for me to use as reference for my other poses. So in this case, I'm choosing clear breaks or parts of the body that define the character in major ways. And then we're also adding little guides for rotational elements such as the hands and feet around the base of those body parts. This will help me maintain the proportions and the volume of the character over the course of the 8 images that I need to create. So as you might expect, creating the opposite 3/4 pose is actually really easy. Just copy the same pose, flip it, and then you're on your way. If you have any asymmetric features such as hairstyles that you want to fix up and make sure they're consistent, you can either fix that now or you can do that later on down the track. So moving into the front view now, I'm actually keeping the onion skinning turned on for the 3/4 left and right, and using that as a guide to maintain the volume of my character in the front view. So the width of the shoulders, the width of the hips, the width of the chest, and the width of the face can somewhat be kept in check when you have both views turned on, because if you make it too wide, suddenly the character will go from skinny to fat over the course of the turnaround. So having that as a guide to see how the structure of the body is being maintained across the drawings is really important in my opinion. The other thing to be aware of is that although you are drawing a set of technical images, you are also, in essence, animating a character. And you are animating a character rotating on a single point. So with that in mind, you may have noticed that I've actually drawn a few extra guides around the hands and feet, because the hands and the feet are going to be rotating around that point. So the depth of where those feet and hands are going to be will change as the character rotates. As the character gets closer to the camera on one side of the body, the hands and feet will be closer to the camera and therefore will be positioned closer to the viewer. And that affects the volume and the size of the different limbs. When you keep those sort of things in mind, it helps you maintain the volume of the character in a very considered way. And that's why I'm actually drawing these frames or drawing these model sheet pictures on different frames of animation, because it allows me to essentially scrub between the poses to make sure I'm maintaining consistency between the drawings. And you're going to see me doing this a lot through this video. You're probably going to see a time lapse of the poses just flipping around, because I'm basically just reviewing each pose as they are. And that will allow me to see or notice any inconsistencies between the drawings, like the scale of the hands, the scale of the feet, the size of the body, the size of the hips, the height, the where the knees are sitting on each drawing, etc. And just now you can see that I've widened out the stance of the legs, because the way that the legs are sitting on the 3/4 indicates that the character at the front would have a wider stance. Or in this other instance, I'm cinching in the waist to maintain the volume across the torso within the front and 3/4 views. So when drawing model sheets like this, eventually you really start to see even the smallest of inconsistencies within drawings. So for instance, I'm scaling up the hands as I draw between the 3 poses at this point, so they maintain the right scale across each image. Even the way that they're rotated in the front view should be reflected in the 3/4 views, which should be reflected in the back views as well. Eventually what you'll see me do is scale the arms entirely, just so I can make sure that they feel like they're actually rotating around that circular pivot. Because just like in actual animation, the distance in which you draw different elements of the character over time, over different frames, affects the way that the image feels in motion. And ultimately what we want to achieve with a model sheet, especially if you're going to rig it, is that when it rotates, it feels like it's a nice linear rotation where different body parts aren't suddenly just snapping and popping around to different locations across the drawings. So out of all of the different poses, the front, the 3/4, the back 3/4, I find that the side view is probably one of the most difficult ones to get right. In my opinion, that's because simply that you see less of the character on the side view. The other thing is that it's really difficult to get a sense of the right volume in the side view as well, because unlike the front view and the 3/4 view, the overall silhouette of the side view is pretty much completely different. And one of the biggest challenges you need to achieve in doing a decent model sheet is maintaining a very recognizable silhouette for that character. The other challenge for doing a side view image is simply about balance. And what I mean by balance, I mean literally making the character feel balanced, like it's not tipping over or leaning backwards too far. So you need to have a very decent sense of structure in human anatomy, I guess you can say, where if a character is standing up, how is it maintaining its balance? The third challenge is really a rotational one, like understanding the depth of the character. And it's really hard to add depth to a character where you only see one side of that character. Part of that is getting a decent understanding of how to animate the rotation. So for instance, with the arms and the feet, you'll notice that using the guides for the little circle guide, that's also indicating where the hand will sit during that rotation. So you'll see that the feet are at their closest point, or at least the foot facing the camera is at its closest point to the camera. So it's at the bottom of that circle. And you can already see me adjusting the arms in the 3/4 and the front view to maintain, or at least give it an illusion of rotation of those arms. And sometimes I'll just play back the animation on a loop for like a minute, just to observe where things are out of place. So sometimes you may even come to a point where you just want to break the perspective a little bit. So for instance here, I'm actually going to force the perspective to show the other leg behind the leg facing the camera. And this happens all the time in 2D animation. So for instance, if you look at the model sheets for Bender in Futurama, if you were to try and replicate that in 3D, it's almost impossible unless you actually break the model a little bit. It's the only way you can make it look like the 2D image. So sometimes it will come down to a conscious choice as an artist when to break the consistencies. So one of the biggest challenges for me as I was drawing this character was how to place the hands, where to place the hands across the 3/4, the front, and the side views. And you'll see me throughout this entire video basically playing with the hands to make sure that they look like they're actually rotating in animation around the body in a way that I find to be correct. Because I felt that if I didn't get that right, the feeling of depth and rotation wouldn't work. So I would change the direction of the arms a little bit, change the directions of the from the elbow downwards, for instance. All those kind of things I will do to try and maintain a consistent animated turnaround. Same thing goes for the face and the jawline. So maintaining a silhouette that looks consistent in the jawline and the structure of the face in both 3/4, front, back, and side is really, really important. Because sometimes it looks like the head is jutting forward and backwards, or just suddenly it scales up and then looks smaller in the other views. You have to make sure that when you are rotating that face, that the scale of the head is consistent as well. And as I've been saying throughout this video, the consistencies have to be maintained throughout the body as well. Even the length of the arms, where the elbow breaks to show that, the size of the biceps, the size of the forearms, the size of the hands, all of it has to feel correct in every pose. And feel is the key word here. Feel correct, not necessarily be correct, especially in 2D, it has to feel correct. So if you get to a point where you're drawing the side of a face, for instance, and you wanted to like completely move the mouth to the side, if that's a stylistic choice in your end, just do that. But make sure when you rotate it, that it maintains the feeling of it being correct. So part of that is understanding where the mouth is going to be placed, how it's rotating in relation to the rest of the body. Other things to be conscious of is where points of volume really lie. So in the case of many students that I've seen do this sort of thing before, it's really hard to get them to imagine where exactly the shoulders of the arms start. That makes sense. So where the actual shoulder structure starts, where the arm begins, It's actually usually a lot lower than what they think. It's not up near the neck on the side view. It's lower down because there's the volume of the shoulder extends to the neck, for instance. That's another example. So at least for now, what I'm focusing on is the first 4 key poses, which is your front view, your 2 3/4 front views, and the side view. We'll get to the back and the back 3/4 in a second, but you can see that before I move on to those areas, I want to really nail the first 3 or 4 poses, because essentially what I can do from there on in is copy these poses and then just erase details and replace them with details for the back of the body. The other thing I want to talk about right now is just how well suited a software like Blender's Grease Pencil is for something like this. It makes the process so much easier than using something like Procreate, for using something like Photoshop for some reason. I find it much more natural to do it here than using it in any of those other softwares, because you have a very decent layering system that allows for onion skinning. It allows for editing points on a very granular level, and you can move things on a pivot point as well. So you can actually use the 3D cursor to move an arm on the pivot of the shoulder, for instance, and you just can't do that in Photoshop or in Procreate very easily. So for instance, right now, the feature of using the soft select to scale down the bicep across the arm is really useful, and that just does not exist in any other software. Well, any other 2D software, I should clarify that. So I'm just watching myself in the video fixing up different body parts of the character and changing the angle of how I've drawn those different body parts, and it brings something to mind. So for those who are doing this for the first time, it will present itself as a pretty big challenge in my opinion. And one of the big challenges really is learning how to maintain the style and the look of the character across multiple images at multiple angles. So for instance, in this version of Evie that I'm drawing, I really want to make sure that as a character, she maintains certain angular features about her, such as her face, the way I've drawn her legs, the way I've drawn her arms. I want to have angular features. So if I soften them out in different body parts, it somehow breaks the look of the character and destroys the consistency within the character design. So when you're doing a 8-point turnaround model sheet, you need to make sure that when you are drawing these different limbs, that you're maintaining the set rules you've given yourself to create a character that is unique. And as you can see, as I've mentioned earlier, constantly trying to figure out the location of where the arms and hands should be. Trying to make sure that when she rotates, it feels like she's rotating. So one of the biggest things you may face in terms of challenge is the spacing between the different drawings, where the hands will go, where the feet will go between different drawings to maintain an illusion of motion as she rotates. So don't feel frustrated when you feel like you have to tweak things over and over and over again to make it feel right, because that's just part of the process. And at other times you may come to a point where you just have to say, fuck it, I need to redraw a certain element of a certain pose. That's okay. Don't be precious at this point. That's what the blocking is all about. So don't get too frustrated, be patient, be mindful of how you're drawing things, and eventually things will start to look better, more consistent, and things will start to feel like they're coming into play between the images in better and better ways. Okay, so about to jump into the 3/4 back view here, and here's a little trick. In order to maintain the silhouette of the character, you can actually duplicate the front 3/4 view, then just erase the frontal features of that character and then fill them back in with features that are part of the back of the character. There will of course be more complicated tweaks than just doing that, such as the feet and the arms to maintain that right kind of volume. But one of the biggest things that will help here is you are maintaining the volume of the chest and the back and the head. So as you can see here, I'm literally just erasing the breasts, the face, and those sort of features, and just then replacing them with a different perspective. So for instance, the eyes and the ears are now drawn in a different location. The silhouette is pretty much exactly the same, but I'm drawing in the spinal curve, the shape of the butt, and then adding in the bikini line eventually. In my case, one of the things I didn't keep was the location of the legs because I felt like rotationally it didn't quite work. But the big thing for me that was a success in this method was maintaining the silhouette of the torso and the head. So apart from the side view, this is probably one of the biggest challenges for most people doing this for the first time. And part of those challenges is down to the fact that you have to start adding in different kinds of foreshortening. So for instance, you need to add foreshortening in the feet because you're seeing the heel of the foot, but you're not seeing the front of the foot. So you have to draw the impression of depth at the heel going away from the camera for once, which is something that doesn't really happen very often when you're drawing a character. Same thing can be said about the hands. So suddenly the hands that you've been drawing the thumb in a certain direction the entire time during this process, you suddenly have to flip the order in which you're drawing the hand. So now the pinky is facing the camera and the thumb is almost obscured entirely from the hand structure itself. Or another example would be that you're seeing the inside of the palm of the hand rather than the outside of the palm of the hand, and that changes the way that the drawing is shaped. So what I would recommend is that if you're really struggling with this part of the process, is literally just take some reference photos. So take some reference photos of yourself rotating around a single point, keep the camera on the same tripod or placed against the book, and just have an interval shot between each photo. So take the first photo facing the camera, step 1/4 to the left or the right, take another photo, stand sideways to the camera, take another photo, then repeat the process until you get a 360 view of your own body. Don't necessarily have to copy the actual shape of your body in your character design, but you get a good idea of how the depth is changing across each photo. So that could be useful for you if you want to try out that method as a point of reference. Now, even if your character is super different to how you are in the real world, you can at least still keep that as reference and then apply that depth change to your character, no matter how different they may be in proportion to yourself. It's also worth noting that doing these model sheets isn't just required for semi-realistic proportions like you see here. Super cartoony, ultra stylized, ultra graphic styles are still required to have decent model sheets made for those characters. So even if a character appears to be very flat and very graphic in their style, you'd be surprised how much depth and how much consideration goes into designing those characters so they work at different angles across the animation. So as you can see, just like the other pictures that I've drawn so far in the front and side views, is that I'm trying to maintain a sense of the same stance within the character. So the distance in which her legs are spread apart when she's standing with the heels on, the way in which her arms are sort of sitting in a neutral pose, the shape of the legs, the depth of the legs, the width of the legs. Again, even if I have to redraw them, I have to make sure that they maintain a consistent level of uniformity between the images. Even the direction in which the feet are spread across the image matters. So in every other image that I've drawn, the feet are pointing away from one another in that neutral pose. If suddenly the feet were pointing inwards on the back view, it would break the illusion of volume and rotation in that character. So I've added a little bit of foreshortening from the heel to show or give an illusion of the feet splaying apart on the ground. And just like in the 3/4 and the front views and the side views, I'm using that circular guide around the hands and feet to maintain the point in which the arms and legs finish and where they sit and the scale of them in order to maintain the sense of depth and rotation. So constantly redrawing the hands, constantly redrawing the direction in which they're sort of sitting, the sort of neutral pose in which they're sitting at. I'm trying to maintain that idea. So for instance, even the you can see as I'm flipping between the different poses, you'll see that I'm adjusting the breast because one is very high, the other one's too low. So I'm trying to maintain the silhouette of even the height of the breast Another thing I had to consider was the angle of the elbow to the bicep and the forearm. So it's actually pointing in a different direction, covering or obscuring some part of the back. So it feels like that neutral pose is nice and consistent. So the back view for me is probably one of the simplest ones to do, because you're basically just going to duplicate the front view, erase the frontal features of that character, and then just replace them with features from the back. The silhouette is pretty much identical than the front. The only difference, in my opinion, would be the direction in which you're drawing the hands. So you're now showing the pinky as the forefront and the heel at the forefront of that image, with a little bit of foreshortening in the hands and feet to show, in this case, I got the character wearing heels, so the toe. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Just going ahead and drawing in those features that belong to the back of the character. The other nice thing is that for the most part, at this stage, you would have already established most of the depth problems. You would have solved most of them by now across all the other images, that just by duplicating this one, it's not going to be much of an issue. The other thing I'd say to just be aware of is small rotational consistencies to maintain. So for instance, if in this case the character is wearing a bikini, or at least a bra and some undies, is where those lines are to maintain that rotational consistency. So you don't want the details of the waistline rising up and dropping in different images. Just keeping those consistent is also just as important as everything else. Stuff like the hair, you can see I've added a little bit in the hair as well to make sure that the height of the ponytail is consistent across all the images. Those sort of things can come later in this stage of illustration. And then once you've done with all that, you can start to draw in the consistencies in the hair. So for instance, I'm flipping the hair a little bit, so when she rotates, that little flick in her forehead is basically always on in her case, it's always on the left side of her face. So even the way in which her ponytail is rotating around the pivot of her character is also, in my opinion, important. So it also helps to maintain her silhouette. So this is why it took around 7 hours to get through this general blocking of the character. So when it comes to doing the final line work and doing the clothing, well, finally, the line work for the character itself should be pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do. But also, when we start to do the clothing, it will become a lot easier to get right. Okay, so here's the final result, and I'm actually pretty damn happy with how it turned out. There are some small inconsistencies that I can always go back and fix in, but for the most part, I feel that the character is rotating accurately. The silhouette has been maintained. The depth of the character is consistent across every image. And overall, if I was to give this to someone to refine and fix up, I reckon that this would be enough information for them to do that really successfully and get a really great illustrated character model sheet ready for rigging and ready for animation. So enough of my opinion. What do you people think about my work with this character? If you think it's crap, let me know. If you love it, let me know even more. As with every other artist, I am a sucker for praise. But yeah, something a little bit different with this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any comments, feel free to drop them underneath this video. If you are interested in seeing even more grease pencil centric illustrations and videos, feel free to let me know. I have a lot of fun doing it. That's not to say that I'm not going to do any other 3D stuff. That stuff is coming very shortly as well. But other than that, all I want to say is thank you for watching, catches, and have fun. Cheers.